Hello, this is Paul O'Doherty, and you're very welcome to Bookbound. On this week's programme, my guest is Emmet O'Connor, author of Big Jim Larkin, Hero or Wrecker, which is just being published by UCD Press. Emmet O'Connor lectures in the School of English and History in Ulster University. Between 1983 and 2001, he co-edited Soother as an honorary president of the Irish Labour History Society. He has published widely on labour history, including Reds and the Green, Ireland, Russia and the Communist Internationals, 1919 to 1943, and a labour history of Ireland, 1824 to 2000. And at present, he's working on a study of the Irish in the Spanish Civil War. His latest book is Big Jim Larkin, Hero or Wrecker, and I'm delighted to say Emmet joins in the programme. Emmet, you're very welcome to the programme.
Thank you. Thank you.
You make the point in your introduction that the Larkin biographer faces three supreme challenges: to ascertain the real Larkin away from his public persona, to find evidence of his life in compensation for the lack of records, and to do justice to his greatness in the absence of deeds. Taking cognizance of this and bearing in mind that he himself liked to give the impression that he was born in Ireland and that he was a younger man, can I begin by asking you, can we be sure where he was born and that it definitely was in January 1874?
Yeah, I think Desmond Greaves has done kind of definitive research on this, and the belief that he was born in South Down with his mother's people was really based on an interview which Larkin himself gave to Forward in Glasgow. It was a socialist paper in Glasgow, and some articles that were written up at the time. And Larkin himself, when he came to Ireland, he always called himself an Ulsterman, and he always identified very much with Ireland. He both of his parents were from around Newry, one from South Armagh, one from South Down. But I mean, studies of church records, I think, have shown that he was born in Liverpool, and he always spoke with a broad Liverpool accent.
What do we know of that impoverished Larkin family living in the slums of Liverpool?
Not a huge amount. Again, Larkin kind of, I think he kind of romanticised the family tradition, and there was a story that his mother was exceptionally well educated and had a great love of literature and so on. But I mean, when his parents emigrated from Ireland in the 1860s. And when they got married, I mean, they were both illiterate. They marked the marriage cert with a cross. But Larkin and indeed others in his family too did develop this extraordinary love of literature and the theatre. Where exactly they got it from is not entirely clear, because we just don't know enough about the family. But we do know. I mean, we do know the numbers that were in the family. We know that they grew up in Toxteth, which was a kind of an Irish ghetto, in a sort of an Irish Catholic ghetto in a wider Irish Protestant ghetto around the South Docks in Liverpool, and we know that they were particularly close. That they all very much supported each other and had a strong sense of family duty to each other.
From the age of 7, he was a half-timer, one of those who went to school in the mornings and worked in the afternoon.
Yeah.
By 14, I think his father was dead, and he got an apprenticeship in a firm that his father had worked in before being dismissed 2 years later. Over the next few years, he was employed at certain times, unemployed other times, and he stowed away on ships on a couple of occasions. By 1903, he was a dock foreman, and in September that same year, he married Elizabeth Brown. In those early years of the 20th century, what were the job prospects for a man like James Larkin?
Well, he could have done an apprenticeship in the engineering foundry. I mean, as a kind of gesture to his mother, who was widowed. They agreed to waive the stiff apprenticeship fee. It was usually a stiff fee which you had to pay if your father wasn't a craftsman.
Right.
It was basically a way of keeping jobs within the family, and they agreed to waive the fee if Larkin, for Big Jim. But he didn't want that kind of work. He wanted to work on the docks because it kind of suited him. He was a big, strong lad, and he liked that kind of free and easy kind of lifestyle that went with being a docker. I mean, social reformers tended to sort of cite, the working on the docks as a terrible life, because it was so irregular. The work was irregular, and of course the pay was irregular, and dockers had this terrible reputation deserved or not, I don't know, for drunkenness and violence and being hard-living men and so on. But actually, a lot of the dockers, they liked it like that. They when they tried to introduce decasualisation, it was opposed by a lot of dockers, because they liked that kind of lifestyle that allowed them to work when they want and not turn up when they didn't want to. It was okay if you were young and you were fit, but there was a kind of a macho culture on the docks which took a pride in the survival of the fittest, and that kind of suited Big Jim because he was a big strong lad and he was well able for that kind of work at that time in the 1890s.
In 1905, he was one of the 4 men to take part in a strike on the Liverpool docks, and the way he had managed that was brought to the attention of the National Union of Dock Labourers, the NUDL, who gave him a job as a temporary organiser. What do we know of his early reputation in Liverpool as a union organiser?
Well, he was injured in a docking accident. It was a dangerous job, and if you're a docker, you're likely to get a serious injury on a job at some point in your life. It happened quite early to Big Jim, and he was laid up for a few months. And he says he turned to socialism when he was recuperating, and he joined the Independent Labour Party. Now he didn't join the trade union. He didn't join the National Union of Dock Labourers until he was more or less forced to, but that was a kind of defensible position, because a lot of socialists at the time, they believed in what was called the iron law of wages. The trade unions were a waste of time. If you got an increase, the capitalists would just put up the prices, and there was really no way of changing society through the trade union movement. You could only do it politically, and that would have been Jim's view at the time. So he joined the National Union of Dock Labourers when he had to, but it was this strike in 1905. He was a foreman, and because he was a foreman, he was victimised by his employers, and he was sacked. But he'd shown himself to be such an able speaker. Everybody agrees he was a brilliant orator. He had a great booming voice. He could talk, without notes for 2 or 3 hours, non-stop. So on the strength of that, the union gave him a job and quickly sent him to the north of England, to further north in England, and then on to Scotland. So he didn't spend a lot of time in Liverpool when he became an organiser. He was organising mainly around Preston and Morecambe, and then the ports of Scotland.
In January 1907, he was sent to Belfast to organise the city's stock workers for the NUDL, and I suppose he was fairly successful in unionising the workforce, uniting, I think, Protestant and Catholic workers. And at one stage, he even persuaded the Royal Irish Constabulary to go out on strike, which is some achievement. How well was he appreciated in Belfast?
Oh yeah, he made a huge impact there. I mean, the National Union of Dock Labourers was known in Britain as the Irish Union because there were so many Irish in it at all levels. And they had organised in Ireland during the last big advance of trade unionism, 1889 to 91, and then they'd faded away, except for a branch in Derry. But they tried to they decided it was time to kind of attempt the reorganisation of the Irish ports in 1907. So they sent Larkin off to Belfast, and he quickly did make a big impact there because he was such a great speaker, and he was such a tireless organiser. And initially he tried to follow the policy of the union, which was to avoid strikes, because the shipping owners were notoriously militant. They even had their own navy to smash strikes. They maintained a fleet of 6 ships to ferry strikebreakers around. So if a strike broke out in the port, they would just ferry in strikebreakers. And the union decided that we can't confront these people. So the only way we can move forward is by trying to force employers to apply the law, trying to mobilise public support or political support behind us. And Larkin tried to follow that policy, but he found that the workers themselves were anxious for strike action, that employers were pushing them into strike action, and he also found that other workers wanted to join. I mean, his General Secretary in Liverpool, James Sexton, wanted the National Union of Dock Labourers to be a dockers' union. He didn't see why Larkin was organising the carters in Liverpool. The carters had their own union. But Larkin initially tried to keep it to dockers, but then he found that other people wanted to join. And then he thought, well, maybe it's an advantage to get these people into the union, because if the dockers go out and strike, well, the carters can help them through sympathetic action.
You mentioned James Sexton. I thought he was a fairly famous British trade unionist who would go on to have a career in politics. They had a fairly fractious working relationship. I think at one point in the book you point out that Sexton said of Larkin that he was no more than a token member of the NUDL and only interested in self-promotion. What did James Sexton really think of James Larkin? And was he just simply afraid that Larkin would take his job?
Yeah, well, they were kind of different. Yeah, they were different people. I mean, in that they came from the same kind of background. They're both from an Irish background, Irish immigrants who settled around Liverpool. In both cases, their fathers had been Fenians, and they'd sort of gone to Fenian meetings in England. And they both worked on the docks. If you wanted to be an official of the National Union of Dock Labourers, you really had to be a former docker, and you had to look like a docker. Otherwise, you'd find it hard to get respect from the men. So Larkin was well appointed in that respect. I think Sexton had a high opinion of him to begin with, but then as Larkin became more popular in Ireland, he became more insubordinate. He wanted to do his own thing in his own way. He didn't want to be accountable to anyone for it. He hated paperwork. He hated having to write to Liverpool saying, I want to go to Cork, and I get your permission to do this. I'll have to spend 5 and 6pence for the train. Is this okay? And so on. That kind of thing just bored the mind out of him. So Sexton sort of gradually, I think, turned against Larkin when he realised he was becoming more and more of a problem. But there was a kind of an ideological dimension to it as well, because Larkin moved steadily to the left. He became a syndicalist, a believer in sympathetic action, whereas Sexton was convinced that sympathetic action was really unworkable and it was a disaster. And he actually wrote a play called The Riot Act to expose the folly of sympathetic action. Wow. And then, of course, during the First World War, Larkin is very much against Britain in the war, whereas Sexton really becomes a kind of recruiting sergeant for the British Army and ends up getting a knighthood and becoming a Labour MP.
To go back a stage, in 1908, Larkin relocated and started to organise workers in Dublin, Cork and Waterford. However, he went against the wishes of his bosses in England and he was expelled from the NUDL.
Yeah.
Prosecuted for diverting union funds to give strike pay to workers in Cork after they had engaged in unofficial action. He was convicted of embezzlement in 1910, sentenced to a year in prison, although he got a pardon. And then after this expulsion from the NUDL, he founds the Irish Transport and General Workers Union, the ITGW, at the end of December 1908. If Larkin wanted a career in the trades union, was it inevitable that he had to found the ITGW? And was there a real need for such a union in Dublin, a city that wouldn't have had the labour requirements that was synonymous with, we'll say, Belfast, for instance?
Yeah, well, that was the big question. Well, Larkin could have stayed. He could have stayed an official in the union, but in the NUDL, but his personality really wouldn't allow him to do that. I think he had to be in the long run. He had to become his own boss. That's just the way that's just the way he operated. And when he was expelled from the NUDL, he wasn't going to get a job with another union because he was known to be trouble. So he really had to found his own union. But as well as that, you had this debate rumbling on in the Irish labour movement for a number of years past about whether Irish workers should be in British unions or whether they should form a separate Irish labour movement. There had been an Irish labour movement. You go back to the Middle Ages, you go back to the old guilds and so on. But it really had been in decline throughout much of the 19th century because the economy and population were in decline, and your trade union movement is only as strong as your economy. So by the end of the 19th century, there was a feeling that there was no future for Irish unions except to become branches of British-based unions. And of course, the British trade union movement was very strong. It was the strongest in the world at that time. It was expanding right throughout the English-speaking world. And it was a bit like, Tesco's or whatever moving in and taking over the corner shop or, driving it out of business. But by the 1900s, there was this feeling, well, are the British unions going to solve our problems? Or are they just going to take over existing unions, or are they going to make a big effort to organise unorganised workers and create a strong labour movement in Ireland? And you had some people saying they're never going to commit sufficient resources to Ireland. They'll always be interested primarily in England, and it's time to form an Irish labour movement. So they go to Larkin and they say, "Will you form an Irish labour movement?" And he says, "No, it's wrong to divide workers along nationalist lines." But when he's expelled from the NUDL, he decides, Irish workers have to be in Irish unions. So he then forms the Irish Transport and General Workers Union and says, the time has come for us to end this policy of dependency on British unions and to build an Irish labour movement.
The Dublin lockout, of course, this major industrial dispute between August 1913 and January 1914, and involved, I think it was 20,000 workers and 300 employers. What had Larkin hoped to achieve in that dispute, and how did that defeat in that dispute affect him mentally?
Well, when he formed the ITGW, it was really a dockers union, and he wasn't sure that a dockers union could survive financially because, you'd be based on casual workers. They might have their work this week, they might have the union dues this week, they mightn't have it next week. So, it was a very difficult, precarious business. He's very keen to push into steady employment sectors, and there weren't too many of those in Dublin. What he really wanted was to get workers in Guinnesses and on the trams. So certainly from 1911 at least, he had been, setting his sights on unionising the tramway men. And I think when he tried to do that, he didn't have any grand plans to smash William Martin Murphy or anything like that. He just wanted to unionise the tramway men, and to strengthen the position of his own union. But as Murphy saw it, this Larkinism, as the employers call it, this was tantamount to syndicalism. This was this new revolutionary ideology that trade unions could become instruments of the revolution, that they should be based on this class solidarity, they should use the sympathetic strike and so on. And Murphy believed that employers were making too many concessions to Larkin. They were trying to find a compromise with Larkin, and what they should be doing really was to smash Larkin, smash his union, and just end this kind of syndicalism in Irish industrial relations. So it was really Murphy who had the grand plan and who wanted to get rid of Larkin. Now Larkin always personalised everything. He wouldn't attack capitalism, he'd attack a particular employer, and he had selected Murphy as the epitome of the bad employer. So he saw the fight very much as one between himself and Murphy. And on top of that, he always found defeat very difficult to take. So, the lockout really wore him out, and defeat, which was very, very difficult for him to accept. He was crushed, I think, physically and mentally by the end of the lockout.
After the lockout ended, he left for America, where he spent over 9 years, became a German agent, came to the attention of the FBI and J. Edgar Hoover, and even spent some more time, I suppose, in prison, being visited by Charlie Chaplin. He seems to have had an eventful time in America and a long time at that. You say that after a checkered start, he ended up making an impact in the US as an anti-war agitator, a founder of American communism, and a famous political prisoner. That said, does his time in America tell us more about the man, or are we still looking at an enigma?
Yeah, I think it does. I think people find it hard to explain what Larkin got up to in America. But as with so much about Larkin, particularly after the lockout, which is really the kind of the big turning point in his life, you can only explain Larkin, I think, in terms of his own personality. You should try to explain Larkin purely in terms of ideology and so on. I don't think you'll get an answer. But when Larkin went to America, he really wanted, I think, a new career as a kind of international agitator. And the idea was that America would be the beginning of a world tour. But he didn't get beyond the United States. But he was a brilliant agitator, but he wasn't actually so good as an organizer, because he just found administration and paperwork so hard to deal with. So he actually found it hard to organize a lecture tour. Now, by this stage, since I suppose Oscar Wilde in the late 19th century, Europeans had seen the American lecture circuit, as a sort of lucrative option. And it could have been for Larkin, but he just couldn't get himself sufficiently organised to make it pay. And he was constantly sort of hopping between identifying with the socialists and getting, becoming a socialist agitator, or identifying with Fine Gael, the main Irish Republican group in the US, and sort of engaging in basically anti-German or anti-British propaganda, and I suppose in some ways kind of pro-German propaganda. But he was kind of hopping from one foot to the other, and he ended up falling between two stools and displeasing both sides. He did agree to work for the Germans in 1915, and they paid him handsomely, and he spent 2 years really as a kind of secret agent for the Germans. But when they broke with him, then he went to New York, and he worked with the Socialist Party with this project to turn the Socialist Party into a Communist Party. But I think a lot of people were kind of disillusioned with Larkin by 1919. But when he was arrested, there was a campaign to get him released from jail, and in a way that kind of rescued his reputation.
In the book, Emmet, you also point out his destructive jealousy, his egotism, I suppose his ability to gratuitously offend Irish and Irish American sympathisers. Characteristics, I suppose, that were more prevalent in his early life. Was he a man that was liked on a personal level, and did he become more likeable as he got older?
I think, I think if you're going to get close to him, you had to like him a lot. He was kind of like Charlie Hoy in that sense. You loved him or you hated him, and certainly by the 1920s, the only people who were kind of left with him were people who were, his adoring fans, and other people found it very hard to work with him. And the 20s and 30s are very, very difficult years for him, probably his worst years. But then in the 40s, I think he'd mellowed a bit. He'd realised that, he was never going to kind of dominate the Irish labour movement again. He was, he was moving towards his death. So I think he wanted to kind of patch up old quarrels, and he made a point of being nice to people and apologising to people like Tom Johnson, with whom he had, quarrelled in the 1920s. So I think he emerges as a much more attractive figure at a purely personal level in the 1940s.
Having been in America in the 20s and that, he was also, after 1913, and having gone back to Ireland, he also had a dalliance with communism, which included getting involved with and visiting Mother Russia. And he got on well with Nikolai Bukharin, the Russian Bolshevik revolutionary theorist who Stalin purged in the 1930s. Was he ever seriously a communist?
Well, I think he saw communism as kind of the latest form of revolutionism, and he was a revolutionary. He kind of, he started off in the Independent Labour Party in Britain, which was a kind of a non-Marxist, but a kind of a radical sort of Labour Party, sort of mildly socialist. But then he kind of moved into revolutionism, but he didn't have any kind of time for theory, and to him communism was just the latest version of the class, the revolutionary class struggle, and he had this sense of loyalty to Russia because it was the first worker state, and that seemed to be hugely important, of course, to a lot of people on the left at the time. It was the first worker state, it was a socialist sixth of the earth, and so on. So there was a sense of solidarity with, the Soviet Union, and a reluctance to criticize the Soviet Union in the West. But he never really got involved with any kind of, theoretical stuff, and you couldn't call him a Marxist at the theoretical level. But he did believe in, the basics of class struggle, and he was certainly anti-capitalist.
To go back a stage, back to the 1916 Rising. Prior to that, I suppose James Connolly is always remembered as one of the guys who formed the Irish Citizens' Army, when a lot of that praise should have gone to Larkin. Yeah.
There's been a tendency, to see, Connolly as the Republican, the nationalist, and Larkin as the internationalist. The Transport Union had a pageant to mark its 75th anniversary in 1984, and it showed Connolly and Larkin on stage after the lockout, and Connolly's carrying a green flag and saying, "I'm going to fight for an Irish Republic," and Larkin is carrying a red flag and he's saying, "I'm going off to America to fight for the international working class." Well, the pageant was written by Owen Harris, so that's the kind of nonsense you would expect. But that's the way we remember them, you know. But if you look at the sources, you find that Larkin is every bit as much a Republican as Connolly. In some ways, he's more so. Because, I mean, Connolly always tried to justify his nationalism in Marxist terms. You know, he didn't like going in for the sort of mawkish sentimentality of nationalism. You know, he said Ireland means nothing to me without our people and so on. Whereas Larkin was more inclined to say, well, I'm a nationalist because I'm Irish and I believe in the Irish nation, and the fella that doesn't like his own far side won't like anybody else's far side either, and so on, you know. Larkin made a few efforts to learn Irish and use the Irish language now and again. I don't know that Connolly ever did that.
And how is it to a great extent that he's been written out of Irish trade union history over the last number of years?
Larkin?
Yeah.
Well, yes and no. I mean, he's always. They did try, I think, to ignore him after he died, because you see, he'd been so controversial, particularly when he came back to Ireland in 1923. You know, the people who took over the transport union never forgave Larkin. Well, William O'Brien, anyway. You know, he never forgave Larkin for the trouble he caused. So you couldn't mention Larkin's name in Liberty Hall, you know, in the 50s and 60s or even 70s. But they realised, I think, that at the 50th anniversary of the lockout, that you had to commemorate the lockout. The lockout was the sort of foundation myth of the Irish trade union movement. It was important to the Irish trade union movement as Easter week is to the modern Irish state. William O'Brien had, you know, he'd actually written a history of the lockout without mentioning Larkin's name. Well, that was just laughable. They realised you couldn't do that. But how could you get around this problem of dealing with Larkin but avoiding all the controversy? So the answer was to keep him tied to 1913. Just keep him as the hero of 1913. Keep him as a man with the simple message of, you know, solidarity, class struggle, and you know, standing by trade unionism. Don't talk about his syndicalism, his communism, his republicanism, the fact that he was so critical of British-based unions and so on.
And ultimately, Emmet, was Big Jim Larkin a hero or a wrecker?
I think he was both, but I mean, I think, as I say at the start, the job is really to do justice to history and the fact that he was a wrecker. At the same time, to remember that he undoubtedly was a hero. What he achieved between 1907 and 1913 in Irish trade unionism was remarkable. He completely revolutionised Irish trade unionism. To my mind, he was, for all his faults, he was the greatest ever Irish trade union leader.
And that comes through in your fabulous biography. Emmet O'Connor, it's been a pleasure talking to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, yeah.
Big Jim Larkin, Hero or Wrecker, is published by UCD Press. That's a book I thoroughly recommend for anyone interested in that period of history or in Jim Larkin. OK, that's all we have for you this week. My thanks to Emmet O'Connor and to Paul Hayes on sound. You've been listening to Bookbound on 103.2 Dublin City FM. Stay tuned for Svetlana and the Russian Show. Until next time, this is Paul O'Doherty saying good luck. Good luck.